Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leigh Grant. I'm the newest addition to the Center for Progressive Urban Politics, here doing my very first podcast on the Death with Dignity Act with Mr. Don Collins. I'm very fortunate to be here to speak with him and his work on the issue. And I'm very excited to be here for personal reasons. One of the reasons why I'm so passionate about discussing this is because of my background as a philosophy major. I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, where I concentrated in philosophy and focused in ethics, and found my interest in medical and bioethics. Once I returned home from my collegiate studies, I was fortunate enough to serve on a medical ethics board at a local hospital, where I have been forced to review policies and procedures concerning end-of-life care to ensure that it was mutually beneficial for physicians, clinicians, and the patients and their families. Here with me today is Mr. Don Collins. He is a former U.S. Navy officer, banker, venture capitalist, current freelance writer in Washington, D.C. He has spent 40 years working for women's reproductive health as a board member for Planned Parenthood Federation of America, the Guttmacher Institute, Family Health International, and IPAS. He is an undergraduate from Yale University and received his MBA from NYU. He is the author of From the Dissident Left, a collection of essays, 2004 to 2013. Don Collins, thank you very much for joining us today. How are you?
Well, thank you for having me. You know, this issue of death with dignity really comes out of the background work that I have been involved with since 1965, which is to try in every respect to obtain reproductive rights for women around the world. And through that work, I also became acquainted with this issue. The founder of the organization that is now spearheading this work is a former legislative assistant from Oregon named Barbara Combs-Lee. And Barbara and I have been friends for many years. The idea really comes in a parallel way to the very controversial issue of abortion, which, as you recall, was authorized by the Supreme Court in a sweeping decision which allowed abortion on demand until it was in many ways undercut by later activity. And now the people that run the Death with Dignity organization feel that they wanted to go, instead of having a one decision from the Supreme Court, they wanted to go by state. So each state could decide what it wanted to do about this critical issue, and therefore not have this lingering controversy, which we still have to this day, over the abortion issue. And I think it's a good plan, and I think it's a plan that's working. In fact, let me just quickly explain that the Death with Dignity laws are also known as physician-assisted dying or aid in dying laws, which stem from the idea that it is the terminally ill people, not the government, and its politicians or their ideology or religious leaders or any other kind of dogma who should make the end-of-life decisions and determine how much pain and suffering they should endure. Death with Dignity statutes allow mentally competent adult state residents who have a terminal illness with a confirmed prognosis of having 6 or fewer months to live to voluntarily request and receive a prescription medication to hasten their inevitable imminent death. And by adding a voluntary option to the continuum of the end-of-life care, these laws give patients dignity, control, and peace of mind during their final days with their family and their loved ones. And the protection of the Act ensure that the patients remain the driving force in the end-of-life care decisions, including, I might point out, the law does make sure that if there's an insurance policy involved, they would not lose the benefit of that policy by undertaking this particular course of action. I can give you more specifics about which states are involved, but Leigh, perhaps you have some other points you'd like to make.
Well, currently, right now, it should be available in 6 states, if I'm correct. It started in Oregon in 1997 with their landmark decision.
Correct. Let me just say that 5 states and the Washington, D.C., which is actually 6, the California End-of-Life Option Act, which was passed in 2016, and then the Colorado Act was called End-of-Life Options Act, and then the District of Columbia, which is a process I got involved with, and perhaps can comment on that in a minute. And then Oregon, which was really the granddaddy of them all, and this was the one that Barbara Combs-Leigh was so instrumental in getting put forward. It was a landmark act, and it was done in 1994 and amended in 1997, and it has worked perfectly. There's no incidents that can be reported that somebody was knocked off by an errant relative who was trying to get their money. So Vermont then passed the Patient Choice and Control at the End of Life Act in 2013, and then the Washington D.C., or rather Washington State, passed in 2008. Let me just say about the Washington D.C. Act, which my wife and I actually went down and testified in front of the council members, 14 of them. And my testimony took a little different tact. I had been married to a wonderful woman who, in 1990, contracted lung cancer. And she and I made every effort that we could to attain relief from that. But she died in 1993. And I wanted to make this point. At no point during that process did my wife ever seek or want to have the benefit of this act. She wanted to live her full life. And this is why I mentioned this to the city council here in Washington, that what we're talking here is about choice, the importance of giving every person the right to make that decision. Now, you could argue, I think very plausibly, that it would be really nice if somebody had a stroke or if somebody was physically incapable of following through on what the doctor might present in the way of pills. That probably will never happen because of the difficulty of determining whether or not that was a voluntary act. And that act, therefore, we've gone about as far as we could go, as the old song goes. And I think that the fact that this organization that Ms. Leigh heads is going to go to all states to get this done state by state may take longer, but when it is done, it will be done successfully, and there will be should be no backlash from those who would be trying to intervene on the personal wishes of somebody who is terminally ill.
Right. And I agree with those sentiments. So can we back up a little bit? Can you tell us how you became involved with the Washington, D.C. bill? I read in one of the articles that you wrote that you and your wife were engaged in work on this for 3 days. Can you tell me a little bit more what that work involved?
I can, Leigh, and it was sort of an interesting thing for me because we're both elderly. I suppose we would be considered candidates for this law, so I guess we have a self-interest in testifying, and it was through, of course, Barbara and her colleagues that we got involved, and their local people here asked if we would go down and participate. And when we did, we were joined by many other people, including an Anglican bishop, including people from the LGBT community, all the various people involved in. So we're not talking about ethnicity, we're talking about choice. And we went down and spent long hours. Actually, we went down twice. One day, I think we were there for 8 or 10 hours. There were a huge number of people in the room. And finally, almost it seemed like the end of the day, they let me come forward. The chairman of the committee is a very nice woman named Mrs. Alexander, and she noted that my middle name is Alexander, so we immediately got along handsomely. And I then launched into what I just said about my late wife and the fact that I respected her total wishes, but that her wishes should not impinge on the wishes of others who wish to take another course of action. So it was a very interesting angle to be able to put forward and talk about the voluntary aspect of this in a room filled with people who were so ridden with the idea that they had to, that this was committing suicide. This is not committing suicide at all.
So in what way do you feel that it's not death by suicide? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you do have to self-administer the medication. It's not allowing the physician to administer the dose. It's just making it permissible for them to write the script without repercussions on their medical license.
That's exactly right. So we're trying to protect the provider, and we're trying to give the option to the person that wants to do it. So therefore, if I walked in there and I'm in pretty healthy condition and I said, gee, I'd like to pop into this little program. It sounds like a good idea. I'm tired of life. I can't do that. Right. So we're talking about a very restricted, very carefully organized program that would allow somebody who's on the cusp of death to come up with a solution that meets their needs. We're not reaching heavily into suicide. What we're doing is reaching into the humanistic need to reach somebody who is in desperate shape and would like very much not to suffer. And the stories that you can hear that I've heard from Barbara Combs Lee and others about how people were not allowed to do that are legion. There's just so many cases where people have been abused and tortured, literally tortured by the fact that they had to be kept alive and under circumstances which you and I think would find totally untenable.
So do you think that the palliative care options that we have currently are able to alleviate the suffering in a good enough way that perhaps death with dignity acts aren't needed? I mean, that is one of the arguments. One of the arguments for against death with dignity is that death with dignity is kind of coming in and superseding what palliative care ought to be doing.
Mm-hmm. So, I think that's a very good question. I'm glad you asked that, and I certainly would not. I would be very hopeful if my internist, let's say, or my doctor, the presiding physician over me at that point, were of such mind that they would be helpful under all circumstances. Unfortunately, I don't think that's proved to be the case. Time and time again, people are kept alive far into the pain, far into the difficulty that they would rather avoid. And you hear these stories about, oh, yes, well, we gave this patient a little more morphine and it was necessary, and that took care of the situation. That's fine if you have somebody who voluntarily wants to do that. But if you don't have a legal background and a basis for taking care of it, then this is leaving it to the doctor rather than leaving it to the patient. the patient, after all, should be the one that has the call. And if they're not insensate, I went to the bedside of one of my dear friends recently, and he was so insensate that he couldn't have participated in the program. And there's many cases like that. And I would hope that a presiding physician would have the kindness to administer a palliative drug that would help that person through any kind of pain or difficulty so that he could be relieved of a life that is no longer tenable.
And it is necessary to have these permissible laws because from what I understand and based off of a Hastings Center study, Hastings Center being a large bioethical center.
Yes.
They had conducted a survey of physicians on the subject of physician-assisted suicide. And, how frequently is this actually happening, regardless of any Death with Dignity Act? And while it's very difficult to get actual numbers and to have physicians really open up about what this looks like, the Hastings Center report did find that there is this sort of, don't ask, don't tell, we don't talk about it. But when patients are experiencing an end-of-life option and they are suffering, that there are some bedside decisions regardless of whether or not a Death with Dignity Act exists in that law. So do you think it's important just to be able to protect the physicians? And what do you say to those physicians that say, I want to opt out because I'm personally against it? Or do you think physicians ought to be the ones administering the medication? And do you think physicians really ought to be the ones to write that prescription based upon their oath that they've taken?
Well, I think that in the administration of this law, a physician who wouldn't wouldn't prescribe, has the right to opt out. I mean, there's nobody saying that they should be required to do something that's against their beliefs. What I am saying is that what you're saying, if you don't have a law to back this up, you're asking for anarchy, because then you've got a whole range of choices from physicians, and you might not have the right position. Now, again, if somebody is really enfeebled and barely able to function, there may be members of the family that say, oh, we won't do anything, we'll just let them suffer. But to me, if you had the option, I would be very strongly in favor of having state laws in place in every state. Now, that likely isn't going to happen in my lifetime, being 87, excuse me, but it will probably come about. And by the way, there's one country where an alien can go and have it done in a very orderly and businesslike way, and that's Switzerland. And you can go there. That act has been in place since 1937. They recently tried to knock it off, and something like 75 or 80% of the people said, don't you dare. And one of my colleagues was asked to take a person over there, which they did. This was about 2 years ago. And she described for me the very orderly process that they went through. All the paperwork, all the way in which it was done was very professional. Ultimately, the person who wanted to leave this world went to the place where that's done, and they took a video of her statement, which made very clear that she was ready to leave. And at that point, they administered the drugs, which make it painless, and they then cremated this person. And part of the service includes sending the ashes to wherever they would like to be sent. And it's really a very successful process, and anybody can go there. Mm-hmm. This is not something now. If I didn't live in Washington D.C., which now has access to this new law, I would have to move, as many people have done, as Barbara has explained. Will move to a state where the law is in place, and they will get it done in that state, and they will establish residency there and go through the process. Right. But no one should have to do that. It should be a universal thing. All 50 states, and including the district, and that'll take some time. It's like any other social movement, and as we move forward, I could only hope that this can be done. They have. Last time I talked to the head of this organization, they had filed in 31 states, I believe. So they're moving along, and they would certainly solicit your financing, because you do something like this, and it gets very complicated, and you could send your contribution to Death with Dignity in Portland, Oregon, and I'm sure that this can be easily put on the screen so you can actually see it and hear about exactly where to send your support. It happens to be one of the charities that I feel very strongly about assisting every year.
So I'm glad you brought up what was happening over in Switzerland, because it's been our current laws are kind of being compared to what's going on in Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Belgium, who of course have some different criteria in order to qualify for their programs over there. And in one of the testimonies for the DC bill, there was a couple, Mr. Chuck Ludlam and Ms. Paula Hershoff, had stated, and as I read it here, it said that they supported the legislation as introduced. And then Mr. Ludlam came in and said, however, at some point after we see that people have been using this new law as intended without abuse, we would prefer that it be extended beyond cases of terminal disease. Terminal illness is not a requirement under death with dignity laws in the Netherlands or Belgium. And we can well imagine cases where suffering is not terminal but unbearable. Do you feel as though that the laws here and criteria to qualify to request death with dignity are too strict? Do you feel as though we should maybe eliminate the terminal illness requirement and the 6 months prognosis?
I think that's a very important question. And here I would say, yes, I like the Swiss law when people can make a judgment for whatever reason, whether it's terminal illness or terminal depression or whatever they happen to feel, that life is not worth living. But I think we have to be very conscious of the political reality that has surrounded, for example, the provision of abortion services in the United States. There are 85 counties in the United States. 85% of all the counties in the United States don't have an abortion service available. And it's not very simple, as I've written about frequently. It's not as simple for a woman to obtain relief from a pregnancy she does not wish, as people seem to think. Yes, this is I like the Europeans. The Europeans, by the way, are so far ahead of us on sex education and so many other subjects that it's a little bit silly to even try to discuss it. But I think this is a good start, and we've made a good start. We, with the number of states and D.C. that have it, and it seems to me to set a pattern which can be more readily replicated because of the very, very clean and successful record in Oregon, which has been in effect for so long. There just isn't anything that anybody can say about that that they could argue about from a practical standpoint. And I asked Barbara Combs-Lee at one point, once the decision is made, the person that gets the pills, and they then have the right to take them at any point they wish in the privacy of their home, surrounded by their loved ones. In fact, a friend of mine did that right down the street here in the house on the same street I live on, surrounded by a loving family. So there was a case of people, taking this thing on the right basis, and I just feel that we can't go any farther right now than we're going, but we should be going to all 50 states and get it done because it's the right thing to do.
And do you think the current criteria that exists in many of the states, the 5 states in the District of Columbia, do you think that criteria protects the patient from potential coercion and abuse?
That's been the history in Oregon. There just is not anybody that's ever said anything about killing old Aunt Millie to get her money. And that to me is the sense of, and the way it's written in all these states, that's my understanding. It would be very difficult for somebody to do that. Now, admittedly, I can't say what can happen. There's always an exception, right. But statistically, it's worked out about as well as you could imagine.
So let's talk about some of the other critiques of Death with Dignity acts, especially surrounding the Washington, D.C. bill. It ended up going through the House Oversight Committee under the Home Rule Act, where they put in their disapproval. That was led by Republican House of Representative Jason Chaffetz,
yes,
who you affectionately referred to, and I believe I'm quoting this correctly, the twerp from Utah. Yeah. And that was in the Church and State online article in the UK. And one of his hesitations or his main primary opposition to it was that he feels as though this is going to create a marketplace for death. How do you respond to that? Do you think it's going to become so lax that we're going to have end-of-life clinics that are happening over in the Netherlands and things like that, and we're just going to be pushing death?
I suppose Mr. Chavez would agree that there's, of course, a huge marketplace for death. We're all exiting at some point. The question will be how we exit and under what conditions we exit. If he'd like to make it as painful as possible, which, of course, his opposition seems to indicate, then I happen to be very much against his position. But he stated his position. He put it out there after he realized that 12 of the members of the council were out of 14 were in favor of it. I guess the even when he tried to get his colleagues in the Congress, you realize that the Congress rules Washington in a peremptory way, and they kept and many things that are laid upon the poor city of Washington are instigated by the Congress. Apparently, wiser heads prevailed because even the Republican Party, which does not seem to be wholly liberal, decided not to stamp Chavez's plan to cancel the bill at the end. It went through. It's now in place, and as far as I know, it's fully operative. Now, let me just say that, again, what happened in Oregon? When you get the pills, how many people actually take the option? That to me is a very interesting point. So I was having lunch with Barbara at the Cosmos Club a couple of years ago, and I asked her, I said, well, my impression was that there was quite a small percentage that actually prevailed. She said, no, it's closer to half. In other words, all the people that get the right to take the pills, about half the people actually take the pills. The rest of them actually simply expire. Mm-hmm. And there are many ways that these things can happen. It gives them the privacy to do it in their own homes. They don't have to do it on a hospital. They don't have to do it without people around them. If people are aware that they have the capacity to pull the cord when they want to, then they can call in their family. They can take time. They can make sure that the final results of the legal thing, the personal wishes they want to make, the hugs and kisses that are so necessary in times like that, can happen. And it makes it a totally different situation than if you are in a hospital somewhere suffering your last breath and somebody finally comes in and generously gives you a shot of morphine that kills you. I'd rather do it at home, and I'd like to do it under this circumstances that this present law allows.
Right. And so let's talk a little bit more about with the opposition. I know that you were really heavily criticizing the fact that it was a lot of the religious views that seemed to be opposing this. And one of their arguments is the sanctity of life. And there was a debate at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine, mm-hmm. Where they wanted to discuss oppositions and pros for death with dignity, and it featured Dr. Peter Singer, who is one of the professors there and a leading bioethicist, mm-hmm. As well as some physicians, Dr. Solmasi, and who argued against it. And mm-hmm. one of the things that's interesting is the opposition seems to value the sanctity of life idea, mm-hmm. and it seems to be a very loosely ascribed, what's the word I'm looking for here? Condition on the human life.
No, I can understand that. Yeah.
And so for Dr. Peter Singer, he was arguing more for quality of life. And one of the things that Dr. Solmasi had pointed out was what's interesting about the argument, if you kind of take this umbrella sanctity mm-hmm. of life, and I'm a little paraphrasing here, was he asked the question, well, what do we value? Do we value the person in and of themselves? Mm-hmm. Or do we value their interests? And their interests being, wanting to die on their own terms. And does wanting to die on your own terms under the conditions that would qualify somebody, having a terminal illness with mm-hmm. less than six months or less to live, does that mitigate a person's value? How are we ascribing value to a person? And one of the arguments was that, we seem to get our value from external things instead of an intrinsic value. So where do you fall on that?
Well, I think, thank you for bringing that up, because it seems to me that what you're talking about here, well, first of all, if a person has made the decision under the law, and we're talking now about the law, I'm not going to try to be more broad about it. If they've made that decision, that's their personal decision. Now, you can bring in an ethicist, you can bring in a Catholic bishop, you can bring in people from outside to opine on this particular point of view. That seems to me to be confusing what should essentially be a personal and totally secular matter mm-hmm. with a religious point of view. Now, I happen to be a member of the fastest growing religion in the world, which is atheism. And so therefore, I'm not encumbered by any of the Pope's dictates or anybody else's dictates. That happens to be their point of view, but it has no place in a secular decision where you are deciding, you personally are deciding that you don't want to live and you've got the disease to prove it. Right. And you've got the law to get you there. I do not see how any ethicist from any place in the country has any right to intervene on that decision. Right. And if they do, then, send me an article and I'll try to get it on I happen to write extensively for a group called Church and State, which has a wonderful series of articles about the rights of people to pursue secular matters without interference from those that have other views, particularly those who have religious views or even moral views. I mean, I think you can have a view that says, oh, you can't do this and not have a religion attached to it. But I think we're talking now about a secular matter. Somebody's made a decision. It's their decision not to be interfered with. That would be my position.
And so it's funny that you mentioned about bioethicists who would have issues with this. There was Dr. Kevin Donovan, who is the physician and director of the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics at Georgetown Medical School.
Mm-hmm. That's a Catholic college, yes.
Yes. He actually was present and gave testimony for the Washington, D.C. bill. And one of those, he did articulate one thing that I think is kind of fascinating that I would like to point out. Said that throughout history, we have learned that granting the state legal authority to kill innocent individuals has had dreadful consequences. In the District of Columbia, if you are a convicted murderer and in no way innocent, you would be protected from the killing power of the state. Why would we want to turn that power to kill on our patients with their physician's help? End quote. How do you...
Well, that is the most ridiculous non sequitur statement I think I've ever heard. But hey, you have your right to say it, sir, and I presume there'll be people that will genuflex at your words. Right. But if you think that I happen to be against capital punishment, by the way. And certainly the way in which capital punishment has been carried out under recent circumstances where death is certainly torturous and horrible, really prescribes the why that shouldn't be, because it's far easier, far less expensive to put somebody in jail for life than it is to go through the legal ropes that get him on the electric chair or lying out to be shot full of a drug that doesn't do the job. But this gentleman, I must respectfully say, is not talking about killing innocent people. He's talking about interfering with the right of somebody who has decided that the end of life can be comfortably achieved without having interference of this kind. To me, it's a totally non-ethical issue. So anyway, that's about as much as I can tell you on the subject, but I hope that's okay.
I believe it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Leigh. I think your questions were very probing and very helpful in helping me express my opinion, which of course everybody wants to express.
Yes, I'm glad to hear. Thank you so very much, Don. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you.